Welcome to Profiles. I'm Charley Walters. My guest today is Ian Bremmer. He is the founder and president of Eurasia Group, a political risk research and consulting firm with offices on 4 continents. He is an editor-at-large and a columnist for Time magazine. He's the author of 10 books, and he's a frequent presence on network talk shows and on the internet. Ian, thanks for joining me today.
Sure, good to see you.
Let's start with Eurasia Group. Tell us more than what I just described.
Well, I am a political scientist. If you were to ask me what I do for a living, that's what I usually respond with. So I look at how politics affects the world. And when I got my PhD, I was a little surprised that there wasn't a private sector opportunity for political scientists. In other words, you can go into academia and you can go into policy, but there was no application of my field to the real world, no behavioral political science like there's behavioral economics. So I started the company to do that. Really, it's a job fair program for political scientists that otherwise would be unemployed. It's been 20 years. I started it with $25,000. It's grown organically. Today we've got a consulting firm with offices all over the world. We have a platform business that does data and investment products, things like that. And we have a media company called G0 Media that brings, I hope, nonpartisan, somewhat not too serious take on international affairs to particularly younger people all over the world.
So it's sort of a combination of political knowledge and economic knowledge.
It's political knowledge applied. We're not economists, and I think it's, part of the problem is that you have lots of economists around the world who, since there weren't political scientists in the banks, they would opine on political decision-making that they actually didn't have expertise on. Like, you don't want an economist talking to you about what's likely to happen with the Iranian nuclear deal. Like, they don't have that expertise. But if you don't have political scientists there, they'll just occupy the space, right? So it is very separate. And I think one of the reasons that we've been successful is that we do stick to our knitting. I really wouldn't have a basis to assess world-class economics or world-class climatology. But world-class political science, I can assess that, right? So that's kind of what we do.
I won't ask you who your clients are, but are they all private sector?
We have about 600 clients. I would say about 95% of our business is private sector for the consulting firm. There'll be companies like Coca-Cola and GE and Exxon, big companies, hedge funds, financial institutions. About 5% of our business does come from developed governments. And it's interesting work. It's kind of strategic. I wouldn't say it's enormously profitable, but the Singaporean Prime Minister's office, the Bank of Japan, the province of Alberta. But what we don't do is business with countries or their companies that don't have rule of law. So you won't see us doing business with state-owned enterprises in China or with Russian oligarchs, because I feel that they would probably try to pressure us to change our analysis, and that would be a problem for us.
What about state and local governments in the United States?
We've done work with the National Intelligence Council in the United States for probably 18 years or something like that, so that's certainly the case. Aside from that, I would say not that much. And the reason we haven't done much, even though we offer some of our analysis and advisory work for free to U.S. government folks, is because the contracting is really onerous. The U.S. government is big and doesn't move very quickly, and while there are entire businesses out there, Booz Allen, for example, who exist just to sort of provide the needs of the U.S. public sector, the fact is that if you have pretty highly paid, highly skilled labor, that's not a great fit for working with the U.S. government. I hate to say that, but it's kind of true.
But it's understandable.
Yeah.
It makes sense.
Yeah.
Let's move over to international affairs. One thing I've noticed all my life is that it's hard to get Americans interested in what goes on beyond their own borders. They're just not keyed into it. Do you agree with that? And if so, why do you think that is?
Well, it's obvious. We don't need to learn languages other than English to get along on our daily basis. We don't need to immerse ourselves in many other cultures. It's a big country that's not Europe, divided into tiny places that you can drive across in an hour. And a lot of people live their entire lives without having a passport, without leaving the U.S. So I think that's an obvious reason. You know, there's a bit of we're the world's greatest superpower, we're the best, so who cares about everybody else? Historically, we've been leaders, and lots of other countries have had to listen to us. That's starting to change. And I certainly think that as China supplants the United States as the world's largest economy, for example, which will happen in the next decade, I think more Americans will have to start paying attention to that. I think that if you want Americans to pay attention to the rest of the world, you have to make it relevant to them. And that's not surprising, right? I mean, anything you want people to pay attention to needs to resonate with them in some way. And I think there are lots of ways to do that. I mean, certainly the wars in Afghanistan and Iraq, lots of communities across the United States have been very significantly and personally affected by those wars, and they care as a consequence of that. I think that when we had the oil shock in the 70s, a lot of Americans were, you know, sort of standing in gas lines. They were affected by that, and so they cared about what was happening in the Middle East. I think that when our elections were undermined, the legitimacy of them, by the Russian government, for example. I think Americans care about that. But you have to make, and granted, those are very political issues and people are on all sides of them. But you didn't ask me what they should think. You just said, should they care? And I think that you need to make the argument relevant to them. And I think that's absolutely something that you can do.
There's also the short memory syndrome. You remember one thing now and you've forgotten all about it next week. Is that an American thing, or do you think that's true for people in general?
I think it's a technology thing. I think that increasingly young people are spending most of their time on their smartphones. They are not reading books. They're not interacting as much directly with human beings face to face. It's a much shorter cycle for the ability to digest a constant stream of news and entertainment, which, you know, sort of overlaps quite a bit. And it's I want things on demand. I'm going to get what I want because it's a consumer-driven process as well. So I do think it's getting harder to attract and maintain people's attention, and as a consequence, I think memories, you know, get lost. But let's keep in mind, if you go to Germany today, young Germans do not have the same concerns about the history of Nazi Germany, do not have the same trepidation about what might happen if they were to vote in office a nationalist party, for example, where if you're over 50 and you remember the wall coming down, you feel a little differently about that, right? South Koreans today, young South Koreans, think that America is a problem and that the future is China and that they want to work with the North Koreans more closely. Older Koreans who remember the Korean War certainly wouldn't feel that way. So I think that we'd be surprised just how quickly one new generation that doesn't have the same historical experience that older generations have can have a completely different worldview as a consequence of that.
Well, in Iran, most of the people who live in Iran were not alive when the Ayatollah came to power. So for them, that's ancient history.
Which also means that they weren't around when the Americans and Kermit Roosevelt actually removed the previous government, which led to the Shah, and that's a positive thing. So you're right. Again, I just think that it's interesting that, you know, a new generation in every country, I mean, unless you have a very strong culture, I think about the Armenians after the genocide, the Jews after the Holocaust, where the parents and the grandparents, through society and privatized or religious education, are really inculcating a perspective that is transgenerational. But unless that happens, you really lose it pretty quickly.
Well, there are some stories that don't seem to go away. North Korea, what's going on in Syria, et cetera, et cetera. But there's some things I would like to know more about that you don't hear about on television. I've made a list of some of those things here.
But let me push you for a second. You said Syria doesn't go away. I'm not talking about Syria very much, and I'm an expert on this stuff. I don't see it in the news hardly at all. Now this is a country where we've had over 5 million refugees, over half of the entire population of over 20 million has been displaced. We have over 500,000 dead. But the refugee flows today are drying up. Assad has basically won the war, Bashar Assad. Obama said that Assad must go. No one says that anymore. Obama's gone, but Assad is still there. It's not clear to me. I mean, we have a small number of troops right now, the U.S., on the ground in Syria. Most Americans aren't aware of that. Trump has said he wants to get those troops out. Secretary of Defense Mattis has said no. But I guess I would argue that unless you happen to be Syrian, or one of the countries like Turkey or Jordan that is housing a lot of those Syrian refugees directly, the story has largely gone away. And as you know, Syrian refugees can't swim to the United States. We don't accept almost any of them. So far this year, it's sort of I think it's in the small double digits number of Syrian refugees we've accepted. So I think that story has largely gone away.
Maybe what I've got in mind is a segment I saw on television the other day on Sunday morning where there were doctors in Aleppo treating people.
If it's a segment on Sunday morning, I think it's gone away.
But let me move on to Venezuela. You've got a country that has a ton of oil, but no groceries on the shelves, and their president just survived an apparent assassination attempt by drone, which sounds like something out of a James Bond movie. How many Americans are aware of all that? For that matter, how many Americans could find Venezuela on a map?
I think they know it's in South America. They might not know it's the top of South America. They might be able to say it's a bad place. They've probably heard some of that. The new president, not so new these days, but Nicolas Maduro, has presided over one of the most calamitous economic collapses and facilitated it in the world today. Inflation today in Venezuela is over 1,000,000%. And the average Venezuelan, the Venezuelans that haven't left, well over 1 million Venezuelans have fled in the last year, mostly in Colombia, but all over South America. But those that are still there can't get enough food to eat. The average Venezuelan in the last 12 months has lost 17 pounds of weight. One of the most depressing statistics you will hear in your lifetime. And we're not going to do very much about it because, again, they are not here in the United States. Now, Trump briefly said that we might consider the military in terms of responding to Venezuela. He didn't actually know what he was talking about. The Secretary of Defense told him, no, we don't really have a military plan. He never brought it up again. It was just once that he said it. We do have significant sanctions against Venezuela. The Chinese also have stopped providing them with the kind of credit lines that they had historically because they know it's basically bad money after good. We could stop buying oil from the Venezuelans, which would probably help bring about a more immediate collapse of that government. But the fact is that they already produce so much less oil than they used to. It's not clear that Maduro wouldn't be able to just use that as a way to rally the people against the United States. So it's not clear that, I mean, short of us being willing to provide massive amounts of humanitarian aid to the Venezuelan people, however we might, there's much we can do there.
One thing we have seen in recent decades is if you get rid of a bad leader, you may end up with a worse situation. Do you think that's what's happening in Venezuela?
Honestly, I mean, I hate to say this, but if the drones had gotten him, we'd probably be in at least a slightly better situation in Venezuela. I mean, he could be replaced by another Chavista type, but it's hard to see an economic leader that would be quite as incompetent and as indifferent to the plight of his people as Maduro has been. So, I mean, in this case, I think we want to see the back of this guy. Now, that is not saying that I would support the United States proactively engaging in regime change and owning it, because we know that our history of what happens after such interventions has not been great. But I do think that Maduro, one way or the other, we would all be better off, and most importantly, the Venezuelan people, if he's gone as quickly as possible.
There was some talk that this was not a real assassination attempt. Do you buy that?
We don't know. We know that the journalists that were there covering it have not been heard from. They've been detained. And we don't have transparency. It's not as if CNN or Fox News have correspondents on the ground in Caracas. I suspect that when you see, let's put it this way, it is very clear that it is not in the interests of Maduro or his state-owned media to let it be known that this was a near successful assassination attempt. So given that, my inclination is to be skeptical about whatever disinformation they may be putting out, and to say that it probably was indeed such a chance. Now, I will say, you know, this is not the first time we've had concerns about drones with heads of state. Angela Merkel, a couple years ago, you may remember, was giving a speech and an unarmed drone got within a few feet of her to take her picture. And as soon as that happened, I mean, you had to think to yourself, well, what would happen if this was a quote-unquote slaughter bot, right? If it had the ability to actually take her out. I'll make a prediction. At some point in the next 5 years, a head of state will be assassinated by drone.
Scary thought, but entirely plausible.
Sure.
Crimea. Russia has occupied Crimea for however long it's been. Will this stand?
Sure.
Is this the way it's going to be?
Yes. Does this bother you?
Yes.
Okay, what would you like to do about it?
That's a whole other question. I don't know what you do about it, but it's obviously a violation of international law. Do you think that's it?
So first of all, let's be clear. Crimea is a weird kind of place. And when you ask me about Crimea, it is very different than asking me about southeast Ukraine, where the Russians have invaded but deny they've invaded, and instead are using these little green men, right? And it's not incorporated as part of Russia. I think there is a possibility that you could actually resolve that problem. I'm not optimistic. I think it could happen. Crimea, historically, was a part of Russia. It was given to the Ukrainian Republic by the Soviet leadership under Soviet rule. It was still overwhelmingly Russian. There were Crimean Tatars. Many were killed. Many were forced out of Crimea into places like Uzbekistan. It was a Muslim population. But in terms of Russia versus Ukraine, after the Soviet Union collapsed, Crimea was a majority Russian, ethnic Russian. It was overwhelmingly Russian-speaking. It was a population that was quite nostalgic for the Soviet Union, would have preferred the Soviet Union to stay in place. It was an autonomous republic within Ukraine that had its own parliament, and on top of that parliament was a Russian-type tricolor flag. It also had a long-term lease to the Russians in Sevastopol for them to use as a military base. I will tell you that after the Russians annexed Crimea by military force, but without lots of shots being fired, and then they hosted a referendum. There was no basis to host a referendum. It wasn't free, it wasn't fair, but if you actually were to go to the Crimean population and ask them where would they want to be in Russia or Ukraine, they would overwhelmingly want to be in Russia. So it's a weird one, right? It's a weird one.
Do you see it being partitioned at some point in the near future, or formalizing what's a de facto land grab?
The Russians have formalized it. They've incorporated it.
But has anyone else formalized it?
I think it's been recognized by one or two other kind of crappy countries, right? I mean,
200 or so.
Yeah. Well, I mean, as you know, the United States is the only country that's pulled out of the Paris Climate Accord out of all of them. So, I mean, we can't just say, well, because no one's doing it, that means that we can't stand up for it. I mean, we do that all the time. The problem is the Russians have engaged in all sorts of other really bad behavior that makes it hard for us to make progress with them on anything, right? So, I mean, if it wasn't for the intervention into southeast Ukraine, I think the willingness to negotiate between the Americans, the Russians, and even the Ukrainian government on Crimea, you could probably get something done there, right? Again, let's keep in mind that we kind of forced the Ukrainians towards Russia. The Ukrainians were desperate to become the former government. Yanukovych, before the coup, wanted to work with Europe The Europeans didn't want to give them any money. They were dealing with the Greek crisis, with the Cyprus crisis, the Spanish crisis. They weren't really interested in helping them out. The Americans didn't really care. It's far away. It's Ukraine. What's corrupt? What's the point in helping them? So the Ukrainian president was forced to go to the Olympics, as you may remember, in Crimea, met with Putin, in Sochi, excuse me, not Crimea, in Sochi, on the Black Sea, went to Putin, and basically with hat in hand said, our economy's falling apart, Europe won't let me in, can I join the Eurasian Union? As an associate member, will you give me loans? And Putin sees this as an opportunity to, like, have Ukraine in his pocket, so he says yes. This is a huge missed opportunity for the West. The Ukrainian people get really mad because these nationalists in Ukraine say, we don't want to be a part of Russia and the Eurasian Union. We want to move towards the West. But the West didn't want them. And so then the government is overthrown. Then suddenly the West is interested in Ukraine, and the Russians are kind of rightfully really annoyed about that.
If you're in a Baltic country in the meantime, you're thinking, because we have Russian speakers in our country, is that going to tempt Russia to cross our borders? It's a legitimate concern, and it's an understandable one, but how much of a concern do you think it is?
Yeah, but it's what I don't think would happen would be an actual intervention of Russian military force, informal or formal, into the Baltic states. I think much more likely would be willingness to use fake news, cyber attacks, to shut down the Baltics' economies, to pressure them into having less sovereignty over decision-making with NATO, that kind of thing. Less likely in Lithuania, where there are almost no Russians, less than 10% of the population. Estonia and Latvia, I think you could easily see that happening. And it's not clear how we'd respond to it. They're NATO members, and yet Estonia was briefly invaded by the Russian government a few years ago. They went across the border, they grabbed an Estonian intelligence agent, they brought them back to Moscow, where that person's presently sitting in jail. Estonia didn't do anything about it, and I spoke with the Estonian president at the time, who told me that the reason that they didn't make a fuss and they didn't go to NATO to say we want collective defense is because they thought it would just antagonize the Russians to do more. So they kind of, swept it under the rug.
Let's move to China. Economic bubble, true or false?
There are a lot of people that have made mistakes predicting the collapse of China over the last 40 years. It's been growing on average at about 8% over that entire period of time.
Are their figures reliable?
No, of course not, but we can see the growth. We can still see how much of a middle class has been produced. We can see how much better they are at producing technology. We can see how big their economy is as a whole, how much money they're spending all over the world on infrastructure. So, I don't trust any state-produced Chinese data, but we've got satellites. Like, we can watch emissions. We can look at how much they're buying in terms of commodities all over the world. That's a pretty decent indicator of what kind of growth we're seeing in China. There are certainly bubble-like qualities in the Chinese economy if you think about, for example, the bad debt that exists in particularly the state-owned enterprises in the corporate sector, less so the sovereign debt. That's something that would make me worry. I would certainly worry about the poor quality of air and the general environmental degradation that's in China. It's not as bad as India, but still, it's at a pretty, it's a middle-income country now, and the people don't want to tolerate it, so they get angry. They get angry when the Chinese government makes a mistake on vaccines and kids get vaccines that aren't actually good for anything. And that happened with about 750,000 Chinese recently, and there were demonstrations against the Chinese government. So I do think that there are real pressures against Xi Jinping, the president, and against his administration. But it doesn't feel to me like the Chinese economy is on the precipice of collapse. And by the way, I think we should be thankful for that, because the only thing worse than China's success from America's perspective would be China's sudden collapse, and we rely on their economy to a great degree.
We're financially connected with China so deeply. If it's a mess for them, it's a mess for us.
It's less of a mess for us, which is one of the reasons why you have people in the Trump administration believing that this is a good time to hit the Chinese hard on trade. I understand that perspective, but we do have to understand that it will certainly hurt here.
China's been the world's most populous country for some time, but in 5 years, I read, that country will be India. What are the implications behind that?
India spends about, this year, 10% the amount its government on infrastructure inside India as the Chinese do, even though the population is roughly the same. So, I mean, the literacy rate, the size of the economy, the size of the military, the impact of the countries around the world are not on the same universe. We used to read 20 years ago, 30 years ago, there were a lot of books that were written, Economist magazine covers that were done on these dueling giants that were rising in the world, India and China. No one would write about that anymore. It's China.
Once you get past the population figures, they're two very different places.
Yeah, I mean, India's growing, and Modi's doing a reasonably good job in helping to stimulate Indian growth. He's got some downside, too, sort of more authoritarian leaning. He's more nationalist. He's hurt the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, the media to a great degree. But certainly there's a better shot that India will start growing at higher levels, more consistently, more sustainably, under Modi than there has been in the past under a Congress party, for example. But they are so far behind China, and they are getting farther behind China every year.
Really?
Yeah.
Saudi Arabia. Who is MBS, and why should Americans care who MBS is?
Some Americans probably shouldn't. Again, I'm not, I'd love it if I could convince every single American to care about all of these things, but I think it's important to make it relevant to them. In some cases, you won't be able to do that. But Mohammed bin Salman, who is young 30s now and is the crown prince in Saudi Arabia to an ailing and not always compos mentis king, Salman, is this very charismatic, extremely strong-willed, very ambitious de facto ruler of Saudi Arabia. He is engaged in an extraordinary amount of reform. He's trying to do an IPO for Saudi Aramco, the massive oil corporation that's owned by the state. He's allowed women to drive. He also took a few thousand Saudis in the royal family and connected to them and basically arrested them, holed them up in the five-star Ritz-Carlton hotel until they were willing to give the government an enormous amount of money and operate differently. And he's picked fights with countries both in his neighborhood like Qatar and also around the world like Canada, as we're seeing right now. So it's a very different kind of Saudi leadership. You'll remember when Trump was elected president, his first trip outside the United States was unprecedentedly to Riyadh to meet with Mohammed bin Salman. He was treated as a king when he went there. It's a relationship that has been extraordinarily warm. In fact, I would say Trump is much more aligned with MBS than he is with Justin Trudeau, which is one of the reasons why you don't see the Americans supporting the Canadians right now in this sudden, pretty dramatic fight between Saudi Arabia and Canada that's going to hurt both economies again. So it's pretty interesting.
How does Iran fit into this conversation?
Well, the Iranians have a pretty, they're the mortal enemy of the Saudis and of the Emiratis, the UAE, United Arab Emirates, which is right next door. That is not new, but Mohammed bin Salman's willingness to take greater risks in his neighborhood by expanding the fight in Yemen against the Iranian-supported Shia Houthis living in Yemen, a very poor country running out of water right underneath Saudi Arabia.
There's really no oil, so
and no oil.
They're starting in a bad position.
No oil, no water, no wealth, and a very fiercely tribally and religious divided country. The point is that the willingness of the Saudis to take steps that could lead to armed confrontation with the Iranians, and vice versa, with the Iranians under a lot of pressure from the Trump administration, the Iranian nuclear deal, the U.S. pulled out of it unilaterally again. That means that the Iranian economy is going to really start to take a major hit over the next 12 months, especially now that the U.S. sanctions have been snapped back against the Iranians and against any country that's doing business with the Iranians. So I do think that of all of the pressure points that matter to the U.S. economy, because we're talking about a lot of oil here between Iran and Saudi Arabia. So if there were a fight between those countries, that U.S. prices of gas would increase very significantly, very sharply. That is a bigger concern today than it would have been a year ago, 5 years ago, 10 years ago.
Let's move back to this country. One of my pet peeves is when commentators refer to the United States as a liberal democracy without defining what a liberal democracy is. It doesn't mean that Elizabeth Warren is running the country, but from a political scientist, tell us what a liberal democracy really is.
I mean, liberals in the domestic political sense are those on the left as opposed to conservatives, those on the right. When you say liberal democracy, you actually are talking about something completely different than that. You're talking about a system of governance that implies a representative democracy, free, fair, open, transparent, non-corrupt, that basically has a set of values that advanced industrial countries generally support. The United States, the Europeans, the Japanese, the Canadians, the Australians, New Zealand, those countries who believe that it's important to have checks and balances in your country, they believe that rule of law is actually important, that it applies to everyone no matter how wealthy you are. Now, that's what a liberal democracy is. Now, you look at the United States today and you say, wait a second, we've got a lot of corruption in the U.S. right now. Wealthy people get, sort of better judicial treatment. I mean, there are lots of ways you can say we don't quite live up to that. Always has been the case, perhaps more so now. But broadly speaking, you would still say, in context of the world, the United States would still be considered today a quote-unquote liberal democracy.
So when the conservative Ronald Reagan was president of the United States,
it was a liberal democracy.
This was still a liberal democracy.
Without any question. Under Trump, it's less so, but not that much less so, in my view. I think that Trump's impact on the United States domestically is much less than is generally viewed by the cable news. It's greater internationally, and his impact has been greater internationally, but domestically not so much.
Trump has done a lot of governing by executive order, and the news often treats this as though it's a brand new thing, but it's not. It's been around for some time. Is this a good idea? Is it a bad idea? Or does it depend entirely on who the chief executive is?
It's a less bad idea when you can trust the executive. It's generally not the way the system is supposed to run. What you want is a legislature, a Congress, that has two parties that are able to talk to each other and do business with each other, and that can actually pass pieces of legislation that have compromise. So what you really want is what you had back with Newt Gingrich running the Republican Speaker of the House and Bill Clinton as president and saying, okay, let's have contract with America that everyone's going to sign. Both sides got a little bloody by that, but you accomplished a lot of things in legislation. The political divide in the United States right now between left and right, and more importantly between the Democratic and Republican parties in Congress, is sufficiently great that it's really hard to move any significant legislation absent executive order, which is why Obama decided to start writing a lot of those pieces of legislation himself. Now, the problem with writing pieces of legislation by executive order is they can be overturned by the next president, and which Trump has gleefully done. I mean, you can say that to the extent that Trump has a strategy domestically, perhaps the number one piece of that strategy is to undo everything possible that Obama himself had done. And Obama made it much easier to do that because much of his legislation was done through executive order.
Right now, in August of 2018, the conventional wisdom is that the Democrats will more than likely take back the House of Representatives, right, and maybe take back the Senate.
Right.
If that happens, first of all, do you think that's going to happen? If it does happen, will impeachment automatically follow?
I think it looks more likely than not that the Democrats are going to take the House. All of the by-elections that we've seen have shown larger Democratic turnout and a swing much more towards Democrats, well over 10%, compared to the election that we saw with Donald Trump. I see no, and that's with an economy that's doing extremely well. Usually, if you've got an economy that's growing at the rate that the American economy presently is, you'd see a little more support for the incumbent, not this time around. So obviously Trump, very polarizing. Trump's popularity has not shrunk, particularly since he's won, but he started with a very, very low base.
It's grown a little bit. It seems the more problems he has, the more his polls go up a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, on balance, if you look at Trump in the 18 plus months since he's become president, you'd say he's been more or less flat. He had a bit of a dip, he's gone up. On balance right now, I think he's up a couple points.
He's somewhere in the 40s, the last I heard.
Low 40s, and he started, I think, at 39. I think on average he's like 42 right now. So you'd say that's kind of flat, frankly. I mean, what's interesting is Trump's approval rating when he was elected was much lower than any other modern day president. But usually after they get elected, then presidents sink like a stone. And you've seen that with a lot of presidents historically. With Trump, he's actually had the base, he's kept the base. That's kind of what it is. But that wasn't the question you asked me was, do I think that's likely? I think that's reasonably likely. I wouldn't make a strong prediction around it, but it seems reasonably likely for right now. Do I think impeachment will happen? I think that is very likely, given the extent of the Mueller investigation.
That's the wild card, of course. What's he going to find?
Well, we already know some of what they're doing, obviously, and it looks very clear that the obstruction of justice issue with Trump, I assume is an unindicted co-conspirator, in addition to direct indictments of members of Trump's family, Don Jr., Eric, Jared, looks to me like a fairly safe bet. If the Democrats are running the House at that point, one would presume that they would then proceed with impeachment hearings. Could they get that vote passed in the House? Quite plausibly, if they control the House, sure. Could it then pass Senate with a 2/3 majority? Absolutely not. In which case, we've gone through an awful lot of domestic Sturm und Drang, if you will, some extraordinary conflict and divisiveness with no political downside for Trump. The real question is how Trump responds to all this, and we don't yet know.
Does the 25th Amendment enter this conversation?
In terms of members of cabinet voting against Trump and getting him out because he's not capable of running?
A case being made that he is unfit. Unfit is a pretty broad term.
Yeah, first of all, I would hate to see that happen because I think the damage that would be done to the country as opposed to riding out a Trump administration would be very high. Now, I say that in the context of today's Trump. If Trump were to say, for example, let me give you an example. Let's imagine that Trump were to say the Democrats win the House, they win the Senate, they begin impeachment proceedings, and Trump says, and he's intimated, by the way, that he's moving in this direction, that the Russians have intervened in the election on behalf of the Democrats. They've stolen the election, and further elections must be suspended until we resolve this issue. Now, I think if he were to try to do that, I might then have a slightly different perspective on the 25th Amendment. But we're not there. And you asked me that question about right now. And I think right now, let's also keep in mind that most of the members of cabinet that would have had a significant willingness to stand on independent views as to getting rid of Trump, I think are gone. Rex Tillerson would have no problem speaking his mind in that regard. H.R. McMaster, the former National Security Advisor, Gary Cohn, the National Economic Council, people like that, those people are gone. And I think, with the exception of Secretary Mattis, most of the people in cabinet right now, I think are, pretty much willing to tell Trump whatever he wants to hear. By the way, that's also true with the vast majority of the members of Congress of the Republican Party right now.
A non-Trump issue, guaranteed basic income. Good idea, bad idea?
Don't know yet. What I know is that we have an awful lot of people in the world, as well as here in the United States, who do not have the opportunities, don't have the training to live a life that I think our government should be able to ensure they would have the opportunities for. And it's getting worse for their kids. And so we need to do something about that. We need to do something with all these people that feel like they have been screwed, that the government has been rigged against them. People like my mother, for example, who really did feel that way, and absolutely, if she was still alive, would have voted for Trump or for Bernie Sanders for that reason. I think a lot of Americans like that, and I think we need to find ways to make their lives better, to give them opportunities, to make the American dream work for them. I think that one of the experiments out there that I would like to see more of is guaranteed basic income. But I personally suspect that that's not the answer. And I say that because I think if you just give people cash, the willingness of a government and of an elite to say, we wash our hands of this, we've taken care of, that's our obligation, and now we don't have to do anything else. So in other words, you might disenfranchise large numbers of people if you go that route. I'm more interested personally in seeing experiments run that feel a little bit more flexible. A gig economy, for example, where companies can hire and fire much more easily and are not penalized for doing so, but corporate taxes go up as a consequence, and that money is oriented towards a much stronger and more robust social safety net with universal lifetime training and with better maternity care and paternity care, which the Americans are horrible at compared to other advanced industrial democracies. I think there are lots of things that are out there that have not yet been attempted, experiments that need to be done at scale so that we can understand how we need to address these problems, which are growing.
Well, it's the difference between giving somebody a fish and teaching them how to fish.
Yeah, and I think that most people that are in favor of universal basic income would agree that you can't just make it welfare, that there needs to also be some level of sort of bolstered, especially early stage training. And the fact is that our K through 6 in this country right now just doesn't stand up compared to a lot of other developed countries in the world, and that's not acceptable given how wealthy we are. I mean, for the public, private schools, of course. I mean, if you've got money, America's better than any country in the world, and that continues to be true without any question. So Nantucket will be fine, right? And that's one of the reasons I'm here. Yeah.
Well, it was interesting for me to read that Richard Nixon was tossing this idea around.
Yep, that's right.
Years ago.
That's right.
You go way back.
And he wanted minimum wage way up. Yeah.
Thomas Paine was talking about the same thing.
Yeah, it's not a new idea.
Sticking with the economy, automation.
Mm-hmm.
Is the Trump administration doing anything to address automation?
Trump administration's focus has been more 20th century. It's been more coal, steel. Let's bring jobs back in things that we don't really want to do anymore. It plays with the base. Politically, I understand why he does it. It ensures that he maintains that population very strongly. But they don't really have a handle on how to respond to AI, artificial intelligence, and automation that is increasingly displacing very large numbers of jobs, not just in the US and other places. The techno-utopians in Silicon Valley will generally talk their book and say, look, this is a new industrial revolution, and we're going to create even new, better jobs. And some people will be displaced. We'll need to find a way to train them, but ultimately, it'll be better for everyone. There's no reason to believe that. It might be true. It might not be true. We just might not have as much labor for people. And the Obama administration wrote some white papers on this that were really smart at the end of his administration. Didn't really do anything about it. Trump administration, I don't think, has read those white papers, hasn't really done anything about it. We are very, very far from addressing that issue.
How far away do you think we are from driverless trucks all over the highways?
Trucks, when you talk about point to point, hub to hub, not the last mile, but instead the highways, I think we're almost there right now. Certainly 5 to 10 years we'll see driverless trucks in a significant way. Though keep in mind, right now we don't actually have enough people to be in the trucking jobs that we have right now. That's not been enormously popular. It's a very difficult job to do, and they're looking for, the wages are going up because they're looking for people to take them. More interesting.
Well, that sounds like a good thing, because that means fewer people will lose their jobs.
Correct.
Okay.
Right. So driverless trucks is not the problem. The problem is driving more broadly. The problem would be taxi drivers, Uber, that sort of thing. That's where you could see a regulatory backlash with taxi drivers and the rest saying no. You got to keep in mind that driving is the #1 or #2 most populous job in all 50 US states. I also worry about retail positions. I worry, frankly, about a lot of white-collar positions that aren't the top, but you know, accountants, bankers, financial advisors, you know, lawyers, but low-level lawyers. I think that those are the jobs that will actually really get decimated by artificial intelligence in the next 20 years, and I don't know what's going to replace that. Nobody that I know that's serious about AI really has the answer to that.
Well, nobody knows, but there's no turning back. You don't put this genie back in the lamp.
Correct.
So
yeah.
It's a giant experiment that's going to be played out that'll affect everybody one way or another.
Well, the Chinese system is interesting on this front, of course, because it's state capitalist. And so we know that one of the reasons why the Chinese, Xi Jinping, has decided not to reform state-owned enterprises, which had been one of his top priorities when he became president over 5 years ago, is because he recognizes that the ability of the Chinese government and their state-owned enterprises to ensure enormous amounts of inefficient labor is continuously employed is very high. And that's a useful thing if you don't need labor anymore. Like, the Chinese are really good at hiring inefficient labor. The US doesn't do that, right? I mean, if labor is inefficient, the private sector doesn't need you anymore. And well, the US government, not our problem, right? I mean, I will tell you that, you know, in my day job, I talk to CEOs of a large number of the world's Fortune 500 companies. And I would say that virtually every one of them that I talk to tells me how over the next 10 years they can make more money with fewer people in almost every sector. Now, at some point, those numbers start adding up. And then you say, well, where are all the new jobs going to come from? Because we know that, you know, jobs from, you know, organizations like Facebook, they pay very well, but they're nowhere near the numbers of people you need that the big American industrial, you know, sort of motors of growth in the 50s and 60s and 70s need. It's just not the case. So I just don't know where these people are going to be employed.
And that road leads back to guaranteed basic income, which in turn leads to where's all the money going to come from if all these people don't have jobs.
And it also leads to questions of capitalism. I mean, you know, is capitalism a sustainable model when labor and capital become disentangled from each other? I do think we need to start focusing less on growth and more on stability and resilience. And that's something that right now the United States has a particularly hard time doing because we're so short-term, we're so driven by shareholder returns, quarterly numbers. In that regard, you know, I think that other capitalist systems have an easier time.
As far as automation goes and AI, how afraid of hacking are you? You hear these, excuse me, nightmare stories of cars being programmed to drive off cliffs, that sort of thing.
Yeah.
I know it's technically feasible, but how much of a real worry is it?
My general view is if you have something that doesn't absolutely need to have a chip in it, it's not clear to me that you want to have a chip in it. You know, I think that it facilitates a surveillance state where all data is controlled by really large and powerful organizations, private and public sector, that aren't necessarily operating with the interests of the citizens first and foremost in mind. And obviously the potential of those systems being compromised in terms of your data being stolen, it being falsified, or it being destroyed grows over time. And I don't necessarily believe that we right now have adequate defenses for that. But I also think that there are certainly opportunities that seem to be being developed with a distributed ledger, with blockchain technology, in terms of providing much better security around those sorts of systems that would not be hackable. But then you have the broader question of what happens if we are able to have major breakthroughs in quantum computing, which would make all cybersecurity obsolete. And there are some that believe that that's a 20-year possible breakthrough. So I think there are a lot of unknown questions and answers here. And I would say I'm not an alarmist, but I'm aware that we're not close to really having the answers of how much of a threat this really is right now.
Well, as far as data collection goes right now, in a virtual world, isn't it close to impossible to determine whether or not somebody is violating data collection rules and regulations?
I think that the ability to attribute bad actors as being responsible for things that they're doing. It's not impossible at all. It just takes a lot of time. It's a lot of labor, and there's so much more of it that's happening than the people that would be able to follow up on it and the money that you would need to spend. I mean, we found out that the Chinese were directly using spies to hack into American companies and steal some significant intellectual property. It took us years and tens of thousands minimum human hours to find that out. We made a point. We couldn't get the people extradited. They're never going to stand trial in the United States. You know, it kind of showed. In a sense, it's the exception that proves the rule.
Let's go to a more cheery subject.
Which one?
Nantucket.
I love Nantucket.
How did you choose Nantucket as opposed to any number of other places?
Well, I grew up in the projects in Chelsea, Massachusetts, just outside Boston. And I didn't know Nantucket existed. In fact, I remember when I was in high school and someone had mentioned Nantucket once, and I thought that what they meant was Nantasket. They were mispronouncing it because I knew Nantasket Beach. I would go there. So I really had never been here. And 12 years ago, I had decided that I needed to start taking proper vacation. My entire life as a professional, I was taking a week here, a week there. I was never taking time to really be with my friends and family. So I said, I'm going to start taking a month off every summer. Where am I going to go? And I've traveled all over the world. I love Bali. I thought about Bali. I love the north of Italy. I thought of north of Italy. And I realized people are not going to visit me halfway around the world. Like, I need to go someplace that actually is nearby.
Some people don't want to be visited when they go away.
I am not that kind of person. I'm an extrovert. I am most relaxed when I'm surrounded by people I really care about. And I felt that, I worried that I was spending, you know, I spend a lot of time going out with dinners and playing tennis and playing, you know, whatever with my friends. But it's one thing to get together for 5 hours. It's another to actually spend real quality time just to kind of reconnecting and breathing. And you just can't do that living in New York, getting together randomly on the odd day. So that was the logic behind it. I had heard that Nantucket was great from a lot of people, though I'd never been here at this point in my life. Again, I'm 36 years old. And so I just went online, got myself a rental, got my car, took the ferry, and decamped here for 4 weeks. And I'll tell you that I got off that ferry as the ferry was coming in, and I went up Main Street, and I said, done. This is where I'm coming every summer for the rest of my life. And that's what I'm doing. That quickly, immediately. Enormously happy here. And I will tell you that I have never been to Martha's Vineyard in my life. And it is a part of my bucket list to never go to Martha's Vineyard. Yeah.
It's not so bad.
I couldn't tell you.
Have you been here only in the summertime?
No, I've been in, you know, sort of shoulder seasons, and we're all going to be here for Thanksgiving, which will be wonderful. So I'm very pleased about that.
You had a Facebook post the other day. It was a photograph of you and a lot of your Eurasia Group staff. Were they being paid to come to Nantucket?
Were they being paid?
Were they working down here?
No, but they were not vacationing either. Because so what I basically do is I have the part of, so Eurasia Group is like got almost 200 folks, but there's a group of 13 of them that work directly for me. The Office of the President, the OOP. And every summer we take the whole OOP and they come out here for, you know, a day and a night, and it is absolutely not work. It is engaging and having fun and getting to know each other and being a team. And I love them. They're wonderful, wonderful folks. We get some wiffle ball going. We get some biking going, some beaching going. I took them all to the new food truck at 167, 157, 157. We should know this.
Hummock Pond Road.
160. I think it's 167, but I could be wrong.
Yeah. Hard to miss it.
They love that. That was outstanding. You guys are doing a fantastic job, and we had a great time.
Well, it's quite a perk to be able to come down to Nantucket and somebody else's nickel. In
I guess so.
August or July.
For a day, yeah. You know, I mean, I think it's a perk if you like your colleagues. That's a bigger perk.
And if that's
you spend more
they
time.
Like you, I'm sure.
You spend more time at work than you do anything else, than sleeping, than with your spouse, your family, whatever it is. And if you can't love your job, you know, and especially if you're in a position where you have the ability to choose, so many people are stuck. They're in a job of like, it's either this job or they're not making it. if you're in a position, as we are here in Nantucket, as we are in New York, where you can actually choose what you do and you stick with something you don't like, there's something seriously.
It's a widespread thing.
I know it's a hard thing, but I try to tell my people all the time, please, you guys, I want you to be happy in your opportunities.
And you compare the number of hours that the average American works in the course of a week with the average Australian or German or whatever, and you think, what are we doing wrong in this country? Because we're working so much more.
Well, the Japanese work a lot more, the South Koreans work a lot more, but the Americans work probably more hours than they need to, and of course they work the most hours, interestingly, when they're, sort of have the most potential flexibility. They just keep killing it. And that's one thing I'm hopeful about the Me Too movement. I do think that as more women come into positions of authority in corporate America, there are almost no women that run Fortune 500 companies right now, that they are going to be less interested in only focusing on 90 hours of work and just making the numbers, and instead want something that's a little more sustainable. So I'm hopeful that that's actually going to be a positive for capitalism in the U.S.
I want to talk a bit about your three most recent books. 2012, Every Nation for Itself, Winners and Losers in a G0 World. Tell us what a G0 world is.
It's not a G7 or a G20. It's a world where you don't have leadership, where the United States doesn't want to promote global free trade or does not want to be the global sheriff, the global policeman, and doesn't even want to promote global values, and that no other country is capable of doing that. And that's exactly the kind of world we're living in right now.
Well, I mentioned 2012 deliberately because you couldn't have foreseen Trump.
No.
Trump didn't foresee Trump.
No.
But a lot of the trends he has followed, you had spotted 8 or 9 years ago.
Well, because it wasn't because of Trump. It didn't happen because of Trump. This was clearly coming. There were a lot of Americans that were deeply upset with the U.S. globalism that they did not benefit from. China was growing. The transatlantic relationship was getting weaker. It was very overdetermined that we were going to end up in a G0 world. And I will say that the Trump presidency, which I certainly did not expect, has made the G0 world more precipitous. So it's come more dramatically, more suddenly. It's become more dangerous, and it's probably going to last longer because Trump is very interested in undermining U.S.-led multilateral institutions, architecture, and alliances.
2015, Superpower, subtitled 3 Choices for America's Role in the World. You present 3 possibilities, and at the end of the book you tell us what your choice would be, and you fooled me.
Yeah.
I'd seen you on TV enough that I thought, oh, I know how he's thinking. Well, yeah. I didn't. Talk briefly about that.
I fooled myself. I didn't think that I picked an independent America. And there are 3 choices. One's Moneyball, one is indispensable, and one's independent. And you got to understand, as someone whose first trip outside the U.S. was to the Soviet Union in 1986, and saw that we defeated the Soviets not just by building our military, but by having better ideas, by having an ideology and a free market and a political system that we promoted, that helped bring all these people out of authoritarian regimes. And we brought the wall down in the Eastern Bloc, and it made the Soviet Union collapse. So that background is really all about promoting democracy, promoting liberal values around the world, and absolutely my heart is with indispensable America. But you can't. I wrote the book in part because I didn't know what my answer was going to be, because I recognized that the world had moved on. And even if I like indispensable America, you have to believe that, to support it, you have to believe that the political system and the people of America will actually get behind it. And I don't believe that's true. After 17 years of war in Afghanistan, after the Soviet Union has collapsed, after we have failed so many Americans domestically, I just don't think that the willingness to promote indispensable America is there anymore. So I went for independent, with the idea being that we should lead by example, that we need to be ourselves too big to fail, that we need to have, focus on the people that we've dispossessed at home, focus on the people like my mom, like the people that I grew up with in the projects. And now, to be very clear, Trump's foreign policy a lot of it sounds a lot like what I recommended. In other words, why are we sending people to war in Afghanistan, in Syria? Why are we doing that? Why are we promoting, sort of all of these open borders when we're not taking care of our people at home? But Trump is also very, very different from independent America in one very critical way, is that he doesn't lead by example. In fact, he's the antithesis of leading by example. I mean, there's no one on this island that wants their children to grow up to be like Trump. And that's a real problem, right? I mean, you want to have a leader that you want to emulate, that you want to get behind. And for independent America to work, you have to actually have someone leading the country that is willing to truly put America first. And putting America first means we care about our alliances, because long-term they matter.
Exactly.
Putting America first means that you actually take care of building a country that's united, not a country that's divided. Trump is by far the most divisive president we've had, certainly since Andrew Jackson, maybe in history. So he really is, unfortunately, a very broken vessel for that message.
2018, Us versus Them, the Failure of Globalism.
Right.
I want to read a couple of sentences from, I believe, the last chapter of the book. Things have to become much worse, particularly for the winners, before they can become better for everyone else. This is the ultimate failure of globalism. First, define globalism and then expand on what I just read.
Globalism is a political philosophy that says that if we have free borders, open borders, free trade, global security, it's going to be good for all the Americans. It's going to be good for all the people in your country. Globalization is not globalism. Globalization is the idea that the world does better with open trade and free markets. That's true. But globalism is the idea that you should support all of this as an individual American or German or Brit, because we'll take care of you. That's a political ideology, and if your government doesn't take care of you, it doesn't work. So globalism has failed most people in the advanced industrial economies. And it has to get worse before it gets better, because we're living in an incredibly wealthy time. The economy is doing well in the U.S., doing well globally, and yet there's no urgency to solve this problem because it's not a crisis. I thought about writing this book in 2009.
2009?
Yeah. With the I thought about writing exactly this book in 2009 during the Occupy Wall Street crisis. We were done with the 2008 financial crisis, and you had all these people that were in New York City that were demonstrating, Tent City, and the reason I didn't write the book is because I thought, you know what, it's going away. No one's going to care. No one's going to read it. And I was right, but I'm pretty upset with myself that I didn't write the book then, because that was a bad reason not to write the book. The reason why we have this problem right now, and the reason it must get worse before it gets better, is because most people in positions of authority feel the same way. They're like, we can't do anything about it, and it's not a crisis, and it's going to go away, and so who cares? And that's not going to work for these people. It's why we got Trump. It's why we got Brexit. It's why we have the Italian government we have right now. It's why we have the Hungarian government we have right now. It's why we have the Turkish government we have right now. Like, this is not just one or two data points. This is a very big, unstoppable trend. And it's the reason why I've decided to spend so much more time, created a media company, writing a book like this, creating a foundation. Because if you look at my consulting firm, 600 clients, all of whom go to Davos or work for people that go to Davos, that doesn't feel great. Right? That's not okay. It's not okay to spend all of your time in this environment just trying to speak truth to power. Not when power is making very clear over decades now, over generations, that they don't actually want to hear it.
It resonated for me, and I, having been of draftable age during Vietnam, right. I've got clear memories of that era, and things were certainly very divided then. Right. But I can't conceive of an Us versus Them being written then, because as stark as the divides were then, it's nothing like what's going on today.
Correct. And it's obviously much worse now, and it's going to continue to get worse because we know it's not like it's being addressed. 8 years of Trump is not going to address this, and 8 years of Obama didn't address it. The country became much more divided after 8 years of Obama than before. And some people that support Obama will say, well, that's because they're racist. I'm sure that's true in part, but it's also true that aside from health care, which was a limited non-fix, I'm glad that people got universal health care, but I also know that we did nothing to address, the sustainability of health care and dealing with the AARP or dealing with Big Pharma for the long term. But on all of these other issues, they weren't addressed. They're not getting addressed under Trump. They weren't getting addressed under Obama. And, you know, I think the average American who, you know, is affected by the war in Afghanistan or is affected by free trade that has meant that they've lost a job and so they can't benefit from the cheaper prices that exist at the Walmart because they're worried about themselves, their kids, that are wondering how come we're letting all these immigrants in and we haven't taken care of us first. We don't have much to say to those people. That's the problem.
Part of the way of taking care of us, in my humble opinion, is to let those immigrants in. We're not just helping them, as I see it. We're helping everybody who's already here as well. But
I think
there's
that
room for disagreement.
But I want to believe that. My grandmother came here from Aleppo, right? I mean, I came to Ellis Island. I mean, I am, if it wasn't for the Statue of Liberty and the belief that what you just said is absolutely right, I would not be here today. So I want to believe that. But I think we have to understand that if we are moving into a world where labor is increasingly not all that important, the major reason why so many of us have supported immigration over a long time, which is that we want strong people that are going to will to work as hard as they can and pull themselves up by the bootstraps, we're not going to have jobs for those people, right? I mean, when Christine Lagarde went to the head of the IMF, was saying we need to have all these, the Germans, Merkel did the right thing by allowing 1 million Syrian refugees in. I love Christine. I think she was wrong. I think that the cost of those refugees was extraordinarily high. They did not have the skill set to integrate into the German economy. And even the guest Turkish workers in Germany were saying, we don't want these Syrians because they're going to cause problems, they won't integrate, and people are going to look at us worse. You know, look, everybody wants to be the last one in the country, right? Everyone's like, pull the ladders up afterwards. But I think we have to be sensitive that one of the reasons why there is so little support for immigration in the U.S. right now is because we haven't actually done a great job of taking care of the citizens that we have here right now. Yeah. And also, we have a system that doesn't deal with illegal immigration. We have legal immigration, which everybody says they want, and which is clearly unfair because if you have a lot of money, you can just buy your way in and cut the line. But you know, we don't have a way of addressing how do we handle illegal immigration going forward? And we need to address that because the system is kind of broken. And I'm not suggesting that the right answer to that is building a wall. I think it's a horrible answer. I'm not suggesting the right answer is calling Mexicans rapists. It's a horrible answer. Trump's answers are not good answers. But the reason Trump won is because he found a truth. And that truth was these people, if we don't take care of them, are not going to support your free trade. They're not going to support your open borders. And so you got to do that first. You have to prioritize that. You have to. And we're not doing it. So it's going to get worse. You're going to get a lot more Trumps in that regard.
Before we go, let's talk about your Facebook presence, which I find both informative and entertaining. Tell us all the things you do.
I mean, it's social media broadly. It's Facebook, it's Twitter, it's LinkedIn. Actually, LinkedIn's where I have most of my, I think I have over 3 million followers on LinkedIn. That's probably my biggest platform. And I like it there more because you don't have as many trolls. It's more, no one's anonymous. Like on Twitter, all these anonymous people, you don't even know if they're real people. But, you know, it's global. You can say whatever you think, and it resonates with a broad community. And the reason I do it is because I just find that when I travel around the world, there are a lot of young people that appreciate the fact that I'm just saying what I actually think. I mean, whether or not you agree with me, I do try to promote information that, at least for me, feels authentic, feels honest. And if it's a piece of data that I find interesting, or it's something I've learned that I think is worthwhile, or it's an argument that I think deserves promotion, or something someone wrote, or if I'm not taking it too seriously. I mean, I take my work seriously, but I don't take myself all that seriously. And so, I mean, that's why I have the puppet show, for example, and
Puppet Regime.
Puppet Regime.
Talk about that.
You know, I mean, I just think that when the Soviet Union existed, humor was incredible. Right? People that are mistreated in an environment of state propaganda and fake news, they're smart and they find a way to tell the truth, and they tell the truth with humor. And I think that as the country in the United States becomes more divided, our world becomes more divided, a good way to try to get people to engage is humor. 2 ways to get people to engage, right? One is complexity. One is don't just do headlines, find a way to engage with them face to face. And I try to do that with books, I do it with my TV show and the rest, long form. But as you know, a lot of young people in the world today, the ones we most need to talk to, they don't have the willingness to sit and read a book. They don't have the willingness to sit and watch a 30-minute show.
Shorter and shorter attention
if it's going to be shorter, you have to do it with humor, because otherwise it's just a headline. But if you get their defenses down and you say, okay, let's all have a laugh about this. It's not, don't be outraged about everything, right? I saw David Sedaris here in the island the other day, and he was talking about a graduation speech he gave recently, and one of the pieces of advice he had for the graduating students was, please find one thing to be outraged about, as opposed to the 100 of things that you're right now juggling being outraged about all the time. And I think that's right. I think that there's way too much outrage. And the way you get people to talk to each other, understand each other, is by lowering that and being not taking it so seriously. The issues are very serious, but if you don't take yourself so seriously, so someone attacks you, if you're a troll online, I have a troll of the week. Every week, the troll that is funniest, that makes me laugh the most, I promote them. They usually don't have many followers, and we say, here, I don't block anyone. I don't care. Like, it's just, life is too short. I have no business. I came from the projects. I'm here talking to you in Nantucket. I own my company. I mean, I'm known for what I do. I do what I love. I have no business getting upset about trolls. I mean, literally not. It's you know, if you're in a position like I am today, and you're not just grateful for your day-to-day experience, and instead you're online being hateful at people, you've not learned any lessons. And I try to bring a little bit of that to what I do publicly and to what I do with the social media feed.
Ian Bremmer, thanks very much for joining me.
My
This has
pleasure.
been a real treat.
Yeah.
I appreciate your coming in on your quote vacation.
I'm
unquote.
going to get right back in the sun right now.
I don't blame you.
Yeah, good.
For Profiles, I'm Charley Walters. Thanks for tuning in. Please tune in again next time.